Case 1. Nancy Crampton Brophy. Sometimes, the stories we write reveal more than we ever intended. Nancy Crampton Brophy seemed to have found her true calling as a romance novelist. For years, she crafted tales of passion, betrayal, and dark twists that kept readers up all night, with titles like The Wrong Lover and The Wrong Husband. These were stories filled with dangerous relationships and deadly secrets. But Nancy's greatest work of fiction was never published in any book. It was the life she showed the world, a carefully built illusion that would eventually unravel in the most devastating way. In Portland, Nancy and her husband, Daniel Brophy, seemed to live a comfortable life. Daniel worked as a popular chef instructor at the Oregon Culinary Institute, where students truly loved his expertise and warm personality. He spent years mastering his craft, teaching students to create beautiful dishes while sharing his deep passion for cooking. At home, he kept a garden, raised chickens, and cooked elaborate meals for Nancy. Friends saw them as a devoted couple who loved sailing and jigsaw puzzles. After nearly 20 years of marriage, they seemed completely inseparable. Nancy always acted like his biggest fan. On her website, she wrote about being married to a chef who treated life as one big, beautiful experiment. She posted about their animals and the amazing dinners Daniel made. But behind that perfect image, money troubles were quietly building. Nancy's self-published romance novels barely brought in any money, and they had cleared out their retirement savings years ago just to survive. The bills were piling up, and the debt collectors were calling. Then came the morning of June 2nd, 2018. Daniel arrived at the Institute around 7:20 in the morning, completely alone as he set up for his students. He turned off the alarm and got to work, filling buckets with ice and water for class. In those quiet moments, everything changed forever. When his students arrived, they found their beloved teacher dead on the kitchen floor. There was no break-in, and absolutely nothing was stolen. Daniel's wallet, cash, and cards were still on him. The crime scene made no sense. At first, progress was slow. Detectives searched the area, checked security cameras, and talked to everyone at the school. Then, traffic cameras spotted something strange. A minivan matching Nancy's was caught on camera driving through downtown Portland at the exact time Daniel was alone in the kitchen. When detectives asked Nancy where she was that morning, she swore she was asleep in bed and had no idea about any trip downtown. She claimed she didn't remember driving anywhere near the school. Let's dig deeper. The financial picture soon became impossible to ignore. Nancy stood to collect over $1 million from several life insurance policies on Daniel. Between accidental death benefits and workers' comp, multiple policies would instantly rescue her from her desperate financial nightmare. The state argued that if Daniel lived, Nancy faced a life of constant money struggles. With him dead, she was rich. The evidence kept piling up. Detectives learned Nancy bought gun parts online months earlier, specifically a Glock barrel from an online seller. This suggested clever, step-by-step planning to buy parts separately without raising red flags. Although the gun was never found, investigators matched shell casings from the scene to the exact weapon she had researched. The theory was she swapped the barrels to trick forensics, then threw the real one away. And then there was her essay. Years before Daniel's death, Nancy published an online post titled, "How to Murder Your Husband." It detailed multiple ways to commit the perfect crime, exploring motives like money and cheating, while listing tips on how to avoid getting caught. She had analyzed everything, from picking the right weapon to getting rid of the evidence. Ultimately, the judge refused to let the jury read the essay, ruling it was too old and unfairly damaging to use, but its dark presence hung over the entire courtroom. Nancy was arrested in September 2018, just months after that fateful June morning. Nancy pleaded not guilty, prompting her lawyers to build a story of tragic coincidences. They insisted she loved her husband deeply, highlighting romantic trips they had shared just months before his death, along with plans for an upcoming summer getaway to Mount Rushmore. The gun pieces, her legal team insisted, were simply research props for her suspense novels. The drive downtown she could not remember was blamed on psychological trauma, a bout of amnesia triggered by the shock of Daniel's death. The trial lasted 7 weeks in early 2022, with both sides clashing over the truth. The prosecution focused heavily on financial greed, the eerie timing of her minivan spotted near the crime scene, and the lies she told about staying home that morning. Witnesses took the stand to describe the couple's crushing debts and Nancy's building resentment over their desperate financial situation. Her defense fought back, arguing that the entire case was purely circumstantial. They maintained that the state relied on wild guesses instead of solid physical proof. Daniel's stepson eventually testified, painting a picture of a loving grandfather who possessed a quiet, dry sense of humor. He described a seemingly happy marriage, stating he had never heard his stepfather complain about money problems or marital tension. His emotional words made the tragedy feel even heavier, the loss of a kind father, whose absence left a permanent scar on the family. On May 25, 2022, after deliberating for 2 days, the jury found Nancy guilty of second-degree murder. Nancy remained stone-faced, showing absolutely no emotion as the verdict echoed through the Multnomah County courtroom. 3 weeks later, she returned to court to face her sentencing. Grieving relatives stepped forward, sharing emotional statements that detailed the crushing weight of their loss. Daniel's son looked right at her, declaring that stealing a father and grandfather for petty greed was entirely unforgivable. The judge sentenced Nancy Crampton Brophy to life behind bars, with parole only possible after 25 years. At 71 years old, she was destined to spend her remaining years inside a prison cell, paying the ultimate price for turning her fictional plans of the perfect murder into a horrific reality. The suspense writer who spent years plotting stories about dangerous husbands had drafted her own dark ending, a story where the villain does not get away with it, where justice eventually outsmarts the cleverest plot, and where the final chapter is decided not by her pen, but by 12 ordinary citizens. Yet, this Portland case was merely one grim page in Oregon's history, as a different kind of violence was about to erupt in broad daylight. Our second case involves Jeremy Joseph Christian. Venom like his rarely gives a warning until the point of no return has already passed. May 26, 2017, began as a normal Friday afternoon for passengers boarding Portland's Max Light Rail Green Line. The train carriage was busy, but still relatively quiet, with commuters sitting or holding onto rails as the train sped through northeast Portland along Interstate 84. No one on board could foresee that a routine ride would quickly turn into one of the city's most horrific tragedies. A sudden explosion of bigotry would claim the lives of 2 brave men, leaving the community deeply scarred. When Jeremy Joseph Christian got on, he was hard to miss. At 35, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing 250 pounds, he filled the space. But his towering frame was not what frightened the other riders. It was the aggressive, hateful rants screaming from his mouth. He started shouting loud insults, spewing racist slurs, and locking his gaze on 2 teenage girls who were just heading home. One of them, 16-year-old Destin Mangum, sat beside her friend, who wore a hijab. To Christian, their presence alone sparked a violent reaction, and his verbal attack quickly spiraled. He roared that they did not belong in America, demanding they leave the country immediately and go back to Saudi Arabia. He yelled that they did not pay taxes and had no right to be there. The abuse was non-stop, targeting their faith, their background, and their right to exist. Onlookers later recalled a terrifying scene of a massive, hostile man completely out of control. He channeled all his fury toward young teenagers who had done nothing but step onto a train he wanted to control. Destin and her friend tried to escape, moving toward the rear of the car, but his hateful barrage kept coming. The conductor spoke over the PA system, ordering whoever was causing the trouble to get off the train. Nearby passengers sat stunned, unsure of how to stop the growing threat. A few pulled out their phones, desperate to record the confrontation. Most passengers just stared down, praying the tension would blow over without anyone getting hurt. But 3 men stepped forward, making a choice that would define their legacies. Taliesin Murdan Namkai Meche, a 23-year-old recent college grad, walked up to Christian to try and calm things down. Ricky John Best, a 53-year-old Army veteran and father of 4, also stepped up, putting his own body between the hostile man and the terrified teens. Micah David Cole Fletcher, a 21-year-old college student, joined them, desperately trying to defuse the ticking time bomb. These 3 total strangers, bound by nothing but the moment, felt the exact same moral pull. Innocent kids needed backup, and doing nothing was impossible. Christian reacted with instant, explosive violence. In just 11 seconds, he drew a folding knife with a 4-inch blade and slashed all 3 heroes. The onslaught was fast, brutal, and relentless. Screams echoed as the train finally rolled into Hollywood Transit Center. The panicked girls ran, dropping everything. Passengers fled in terror, some dialing 911, while others rushed to stop the bleeding. Ricky Best fell right there on the platform. His wounds were just too deep. Medics arrived quickly, but he was already gone. Taliesin Namkai Meche was rushed to the ER. Doctors fought with everything they had, but the young graduate did not survive. Bystanders later shared his final heartbreaking words. He asked a stranger to tell everyone on that train that he loved them. Micah Fletcher pulled through, but his physical wounds were only the beginning of a long, painful psychological battle. Christian bolted from the train, but his escape was short-lived. Officers tracked him down on a nearby side road just east of the busy transit station. When police cornered him at 4:48 that afternoon, Christian hurled his bloody knife. It hit a squad car and clattered away. Even as they handcuffed him, his cold comments showed he felt absolutely no regret. In fact, he bragged, painting his horrific crimes as some bizarre act of patriotism. But as investigators dug deeper, they found this was far from his first blowout. Just 24 hours before the fatal attack on May 25th, he cornered a woman named Demetria Hester at a nearby transit stop. He screamed racist insults and threw a bottle at her until she fought back with defense spray. Authorities actually questioned him right after that encounter, but let him walk. Less than a day later, he was slicing people open on another train. His past was a massive red flag. His rap sheet went back to 2002, starting with a violent armed robbery where he wore a ski mask, pulled a gun, and handcuffed a shopkeeper to a post before robbing the place blind. He served serious hard time for that heist, locked away in solitary confinement for years. Once free, he broke his probation terms over and over again, constantly slipping back behind bars. Online, his posts were full of extreme hate, glorifying raw violence, and cheering on some of the country's most notorious domestic terrorists. The trial finally kicked off in January 2020, nearly 3 years after that bloody afternoon. Christian faced 12 counts, including double first-degree murder, attempted murder, and multiple felony assault charges, hate crimes stemming from his racist rants, weapons charges, and the assault on Demetria Hester from the night before. Prosecutors brought forward mountains of evidence, including clear security footage, statements from dozens of terrified train passengers, and audio of Christian's own rants during the arrest, plus the murder weapon itself. Christian's lawyers tried to claim self-defense, arguing he felt cornered when the men stepped up. He actually took the stand, claiming he thought they were going to jump him, saying their stance reminded him of brutal prison fights and that he was just defending his own life. But the state tore his story to pieces, proving that Christian started the fight, that the victims were only protecting defenseless kids, and that his lethal reaction was wildly out of line with any actual threat. Micah Fletcher eventually took the stand, sharing how that day completely shattered his world. He opened up about turning to drinking just to cope, fighting night terrors, and living with constant anxiety. He explained how he now scans every single room for threats the second he enters. He even grabbed his wife's arm just seeing her use a butter knife on toast, because any blade triggered pure panic. Every single part of his life was scarred by those 11 seconds of violence. The jury deliberated and returned on February 21, 2020, finding him guilty on all 12 charges. Christian showed zero remorse as the verdicts were read, keeping up the same defiant stare he had held for weeks. When Demetria Hester testified about her terrifying attack, Christian screamed abuse at her from his seat, forcing guards to drag him out. Sentencing came 4 months later on June 24, 2020. The families of Ricky Best and Taliesin Namkai Meche delivered heart-wrenching statements that left the courtroom in tears. They spoke of beloved fathers, sons, and friends who were stolen away by senseless hatred. They painted a picture of hollow holidays and young children forced to grow up without a father, their dreams cut short by violence. The prosecutor argued that these crimes were more than just individual acts of cruelty. They were an assault on the community's deepest values of peace and tolerance. Judge Cheryl Albrecht sentenced Jeremy Joseph Christian to 2 consecutive life terms without parole, plus an extra 310 months, nearly 26 years on top of those sentences. He would spend every remaining day of his life behind bars, with zero hope of escape. Even as guards led him away, his hateful rants didn't stop. He showed the very same contempt for human life that had driven his actions on that train. In the wake of tragedy, Portland chose to honor the 3 brave men who stepped in. They built memorials, created scholarships in their names, and held annual vigils to make sure their incredible courage would never be forgotten. Ricky Best and Tails and Namkai Mashe became symbols of everyday people making extraordinary choices when staring down pure evil. It reminds us that heroes aren't mythical figures, but ordinary people who decide that standing up matters more than staying safe. Yet, even as Portland mourned, another devastating family tragedy from Oregon's dark history continued to haunt those seeking answers. Now, let's look at Christian Longo. His perfect family was a total lie, and the man behind the illusion would pay the ultimate price when it crumbled. Christian Longo desperately wanted everyone to believe he was a massive success. He drove brand new cars, went on lavish vacations, and built a shiny facade of wealth that fooled both neighbors and family. But underneath the glittering surface, every part of his life was built on lies. His luxury lifestyle was funded by theft, fraud, and a growing web of deception that would eventually swallow everything he claimed to love. Born in 1974, he grew up in a strict Jehovah's Witness family in Michigan. Christian married Mary Jane Baker in 1993, when he was just 19 and she was 26. They built what looked like a devout family, welcoming 3 kids, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison. Christian climbed his way into management, starting his own construction business and projecting an image of pure ambition and success. But the truth was incredibly dark. He was drowning in debt, writing bad checks, robbing clients, and using fake papers to fund a life he couldn't afford. When his crimes finally caught up to him, Christian dodged prison, receiving a surprisingly light sentence of probation and restitution instead of real hard time. But his exposure came with other costs. Mary Jane found proof of his cheating, and the church community cast him out for his mounting list of sins. Instead of facing his failures, Christian made a choice that put his family on a direct path toward an unthinkable tragedy. He convinced Mary Jane they needed a fresh start, somewhere far away from Michigan, a place where his dirty reputation couldn't follow. The family arrived in Oregon in September 2001, settling in coastal Newport. He took a job at a Starbucks inside a local grocery store, earning a meager wage that could never support the luxury lifestyle he still craved. That November, they moved into a local motel, with Christian spinning tall tales to the manager about being a high-level corporate helper sent from Portland. He constantly changed his story depending on who he talked to, claiming his family lived elsewhere and only visited on weekends, even lying about how many kids he had. Yet by December, they moved into a luxury waterside condo, but his house of cards was finally collapsing. He had already stolen a customer's credit card data from Starbucks, plotting to use it for a desperate escape. He bought books on changing his identity and learning Spanish. The walls were fast closing in. With eviction looming and creditors closing in, Christian stood on his balcony on the evening of December 16, 2001, staring at the ocean. He later admitted he knew this was the beginning of the end. What followed next defies belief in its sheer, cold cruelty. According to court evidence and his own chilling confessions, he took the lives of his entire family over the course of that dark night and the following day. Mary Jane and their baby daughter, Madison, were found inside heavy suitcases, weighed down with dumbbells and tossed into the cold coastal waters. Zachary, who was only 4 years old, and 3-year-old Sadie were found weighted down with rock-filled pillowcases, their tiny bodies pulled from the freezing currents of the Alsea River. The horror first unfolded on December 19th, when a fisherman spotted a child's body floating in Lint Slough near Waldport. It was young Zachary, clad only in underwear, looking well-groomed and clean with no visible external wounds. Investigators desperately hoped someone would report the boy missing, but no one did. 3 days later, divers searching the area found Sadie beneath the Alsea Lint Slough Bridge, still anchored to the bottom by a rock-filled pillowcase. A week later, on December 27th, divers discovered 2 suitcases in Yakima Bay. Inside one lay Mary Jane, with clear signs of strangulation on her body. The other suitcase held little Madison, packed with clothes and one of the dumbbells used to drag her down. Medical examiners determined that Mary Jane and Madison had been manually asphyxiated. The cause of death for Zachary and Sadie remained uncertain, though investigators feared the absolute worst scenario, that they were still breathing when Christian threw them over that bridge and into the freezing waters. By the time those final bodies were pulled up, Christian Longo was long gone. Armed with stolen credit card information, he bought a plane ticket and fled down to Mexico. He dumped the minivan he'd been driving, which police soon discovered was stolen from Ohio under a fraudulent registration. He tossed family photos and personal belongings all along his route, and he assumed a new identity, bizarrely masquerading as Michael Finkel, a disgraced former New York Times journalist who had recently been fired over a scandal. The FBI slapped Christian onto their 10 most wanted list, triggering a massive international manhunt. Tips flooded in from all over while investigators tracked his movements through Cancun. Using Finkel's name, Christian checked into a beachside resort. He spent 2 weeks drinking, clubbing, and chasing romances with unsuspecting tourists. He lived as if he didn't have a single care in the world, completely ignoring that he had just destroyed 4 innocent lives. The charade finally ended on January 13th, 2002, when Mexican police arrested him at a campground near Tulum. He was quickly extradited back to the United States, brought straight to Oregon to face justice. When FBI agents first questioned him, Christian chillingly claimed he had simply sent his family to a better place. Later, he spun a completely different story for his defense. By 2003, his trial captivated the entire nation. Christian faced 7 counts of aggravated murder, 4 for the killings themselves, plus heavy specifications for multiple victims and the fact that 3 children were under 14. His defense attorneys rolled out a shocking strategy, claiming that Mary Jane had actually killed the 2 older children after discovering the truth about their financial ruin, and that Christian had then killed Mary Jane and Madison in a fit of rage. They argued that the different disposal methods proved there were 2 separate killers at work, but prosecutors systematically demolished this lie. They presented proof that Christian had researched murder methods months prior and stole the credit card for his escape weeks before the crime. His careful preparations proved cold, calculated premeditation, completely erasing any claim of spontaneous rage. They argued that Christian simply saw his family as barriers to the carefree life he desperately craved, and wiping them out would free him from debt, escape his creditors, and let him start fresh with a stolen identity. The jury needed less than 4 hours to make their decision. Guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase, they heard devastating testimony from heartbroken members of the extended family, the stolen innocence of those young children, and the utter calculation behind Christian's actions. The decision was unanimous. Christian Longo would receive the death penalty. For years, he sat locked away on death row at the Oregon State Penitentiary. He eventually confessed to Michael Finkel, the very journalist whose identity he had stolen, that he did indeed take those 4 lives. Their letters later inspired a book and movie, both titled True Story. Christian even tried to rebrand himself as an advocate for organ donor rights for death row inmates, starting a group called Gave While Incarcerated. Then in December 2022, Oregon Governor Kate Brown commuted all death row sentences, converting them to life without parole. Christian's death sentence became life in prison, shocking Mary Jane's family, who felt cheated out of justice, without any warning or prior discussion. Her sister spoke out, devastated by the governor's sudden decision, arguing that families deserved warning before such a massive choice. Today, Christian Longo remains behind bars in Oregon, serving life with no hope of release. The man who murdered his own family to escape debt and pressure will spend his remaining days in a cell. His freedom is gone, forever punishment for crimes that shook the entire country. His legacy is not that of the wealthy entrepreneur he pretended to be, but as a cold family annihilator, whose selfishness destroyed 4 innocent lives. Yet Oregon's history of violence against the vulnerable continued, and sometimes the predator lived right next door. For Ward Weaver III, violence was a dark family inheritance. He grew up knowing his father was a convicted killer. Ward Weaver Jr. sat on California's death row for a brutal 1981 double murder involving unspeakable cruelty to his victims. Even more disturbing, Weaver Jr. had recruited his young son, Ward III, to help dig what the boy thought was just a hole for a broken sewer pipe. In reality, he was unknowingly helping his father cover up a murder. Weaver Jr. then poured concrete over the grave, and built a wooden deck on top. That childhood horror should have warned of the dark cycle of violence this family seemed destined to repeat. By 1997, Ward Weaver III had settled in Oregon City with his daughter, Mallory. She was 12 years old. He rented a small house on South Beaver Creek Road, right up the hill from the New Creek Village apartments. Mallory quickly befriended two girls from the complex, Ashley Pond and Miranda Gaddis. The three were classmates at Gardner Middle School and performed together on the school's dance team. They hung out at the Weaver home constantly, enjoying sleepovers and birthday parties that seemed totally normal. But Ward Weaver's interest in these young girls was anything but paternal. Ashley Pond had actually lived there for several months in the summer of 2001, escaping a troubled home life. In August of that year, she told Oregon City police that Weaver had tried to assault her at his house. She described a terrifying encounter that left her deeply shaken. Yet despite her report, law enforcement failed to press formal charges. The investigation stalled, and Ashley went back to living with her mother at the apartment complex. On the morning of January 9th, 2002, 12-year-old Ashley left her apartment for the short walk to the bus stop. The walk took under 10 minutes. She was running a little late, but still had plenty of time to catch the school bus. She never arrived. Friends, family, and her best friend Miranda Gaddis began a frantic search. Missing posters went up everywhere. Local news stations covered her disappearance, but days quickly bled into weeks, with no sign of the young girl. Their dance team organized a fundraiser for March 23, 2002, hoping to raise search funds and reward money. But 8 days before the event, on March 8th, Miranda herself vanished. She walked out of her apartment that morning, heading toward the same bus stop along the exact path Ashley took 2 months prior. Just like Ashley, 13-year-old Miranda simply vanished into thin air. Terror gripped the community. Two close friends, both middle schoolers from the same dance class, vanishing from the exact same spot. The link was impossible to ignore. Soon, the FBI stepped in as national media attention exploded. Major outlets like People magazine, the New York Times, and the BBC all covered the mystery. True crime shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries featured their disappearances. Detectives questioned everyone nearby, including Ward Weaver, whose house overlooked the very spot where both girls vanished. Weaver cooperated during the early questioning, even talking to reporters on camera. On August 8th, he gave another interview, claiming he was tired of the harassment and planned to flee to Mexico within the week. That very day, he brutally assaulted his stepson Francis's 19-year-old girlfriend. Barely dressed, she managed to escape the house, flag down a passing driver, and get to safety. When Francis Weaver called 911 on August 13th to report the assault, he dropped a massive bombshell. His stepfather had actually confessed to killing both Ashley and Miranda. He told the dispatcher he believed both girls' bodies were buried somewhere on Weaver's property. Police arrested Weaver immediately for the assault and quickly secured a warrant to search his entire property. On August 24th, 2002, FBI agents started searching the land. Inside a storage shed behind the house, they found Miranda Gaddis's remains hidden in an empty microwave box. The following day, diggers broke through the very concrete slab Weaver had stood on during his television interview. Two innocent girls had trusted their neighbor. They hung out at his house as his daughter's friends, only to be betrayed in the worst way. Now, the same dance team that planned a search fundraiser had to mourn them both. Weaver actually had a prior conviction in California for attacking two young girls without provocation. He was let go after serving very little time, despite his clearly predatory behavior. Case 5, Jacob Tyler Roberts. The red flags were everywhere, but they only made sense after the tragedy occurred. December 11th, 2012 should have been a normal, busy day at one of Portland's largest malls. Christmas shopping was in full swing, with around 8,000 to 10,000 eager shoppers browsing the festive stores. Kids were visiting Santa, teens were hanging out, and staff were working hard just 2 weeks before Christmas. No one could have guessed that a regular Tuesday afternoon was about to turn into absolute terror. 22-year-old Jacob Tyler Roberts was drifting, in a way his friends couldn't quite explain. People who knew him later described him as someone who seemed totally disconnected. It was like he was there physically, but completely gone emotionally. Right before that December day, his behavior changed. He sold his belongings and quit his job, while telling everyone he was moving to Hawaii for a fresh start. His ex-girlfriend later remembered how numb and flat he seemed during their last talk, which deeply unsettled her even though she couldn't explain why. Around 3:30 that afternoon, Jacob walked into the mall dressed in black, wearing a white hockey mask. Hidden under his jacket was a stolen AR-15 rifle, a gun he had no right to own. He walked through the crowd with clear purpose. He headed right for the busy food court, where crowds of shoppers were still hanging out, raised his rifle, and began firing into them. The echoes of gunfire inside the mall triggered instant panic, sending shoppers running for their lives. Some dove behind counters, others scrambled for the exits, and parents shielded their children with their bodies. Employees rushed to lock doors and pull down gates, hiding people in back storage rooms. The chaos was absolute. Thousands of people were suddenly facing the nightmare of extreme violence in a place they once felt safe. 54-year-old Sinden Yule was among the first people hit in the shooting. 45-year-old Stephen Matthew Forsythe was also killed in the attack. Both died in those first few seconds, having never even met Jacob Roberts before that afternoon. They were random targets, strangers whose only link to the gunman was being in the wrong spot at the worst time. 15-year-old Christina Shevchenko was seriously hurt, but she thankfully survived. Roberts fired about 17 shots in total, stalking through the mall as terrified people ran for cover. Then, a sudden stroke of luck saved countless lives. His rifle jammed. The weapon malfunctioned, immediately stopping his rampage. Instead of trying to clear the jam, Roberts turned and fled. He ducked into an employee's stairwell, completely vanishing from the main shopping floor. Meanwhile, police were already arriving, rushing into the building within minutes. They poured into the mall through every entrance. SWAT teams swept through stores, rescuing terrified shoppers while hunting for the gunman. It was absolute chaos, but highly coordinated as heavily armed officers cleared the massive complex, room by room. No one knew if Roberts was reloading for a second assault or had already slipped away. Then, they found him in an employee stairwell. Jacob Tyler Roberts had turned his rifle on himself. Less than 15 minutes after the first shot echoed, the terror was over, but the nightmare was just beginning. The damage was already done. 2 innocent people lay dead, a teenager was bleeding, and thousands of survivors would carry these mental scars forever. The massive police investigation immediately focused on one burning question: why? Jacob had no real ties to Clackamas town center, besides being a casual visitor. He had no grudge against the stores, no beef with any employees, and no past trouble with anyone inside the mall that afternoon. His targets were completely random, chosen only because they crossed his path. But as detectives retraced his final days, they uncovered a chilling pattern of preparation. Selling off his belongings wasn't for a move to Hawaii. He was tying up loose ends. Quitting his job wasn't about a fresh start. It was about leaving absolutely nothing behind. The stories he told friends about moving to Hawaii were just a cover-up for a calculated, final act. His mental state was almost certainly a factor. Yet, Roberts left behind no angry manifesto, no explanation, and no clear motive. His ex-girlfriend recalled a numbness that suggested deep depression. But with no medical records or official diagnosis, police could only guess at what was happening in his mind. This tragedy was just the first of several major shootings that would soon spark massive national debates. Debates over gun laws and mental health support. It exposed deep gaps in the system, showing how hard it is to spot warning signs and how fast a peaceful afternoon can turn into a bloodbath. Families and friends would always remember Cindy Ewell and Stephen Forsythe, 2 beautiful lives cut short by senseless violence. Memorials arose to honor their memories, while the community rallied around Christina Shevchenko during her recovery from those injuries. The mall itself tightened security, but shoppers returned with a lingering sense of unease that never truly went away. Jacob Tyler Roberts simply became another name in a long, tragic catalog of killers who chose senseless violence over getting help, taking innocent lives before finally ending their own. That single December afternoon, he tore families apart, left thousands of witnesses deeply traumatized, and left an entire community searching for answers that could never truly make sense of such random devastation. Yet, while the state grappled with public tragedy, behind tightly closed doors, some of its most shocking crimes were unfolding inside family homes. Case 6. Angela McAnulty. Sometimes, the most monstrous crimes happen in broad daylight, completely ignored by the systems built to protect us. Angela McAnulty's 15-year-old daughter, Jeanette Maples, should have been completely safe. She should have been in school, hanging out with friends, and figuring out her future. Instead, she was locked in a dark nightmare of ongoing abuse, one that would end her young life in the most brutal case of child neglect Oregon has ever seen. On December 9, 2009, paramedics rushed to a Eugene home after a frantic call about an unresponsive teenager. What they found inside horrified even veteran medical professionals. Jeanette Maples weighed just 50 pounds, a shockingly low number that showed she had been starved for a very long time. They found over 100 injuries covering her battered body. The emergency room doctor who examined her later called it the absolute worst case of abuse he had ever seen in his career. The investigation soon uncovered a cruel, systematic routine of torture that had been going on for years. Jeanette had been starved, completely isolated, and beaten in ways that went far beyond any concept of discipline. She was starved, tied up for hours, and hidden away from anyone who could have noticed her suffering and stepped in to save her. This abuse was no sudden burst of rage. It was a cold, calculated campaign, hidden deep from the outside world. Angela McAnulty was Jeanette's own mother, the one woman legally bound to protect her. Yet instead of loving her daughter, Angela built a horrific regime of abuse that doctors would later describe as pure torture. Her stepfather, Richard McAnulty, actively helped inflict or ignore the cruelty, leaving young Jeanette with absolutely nowhere to run for safety. Perhaps the most chilling part was that Oregon Child Services had already received numerous warnings about Jeanette's situation over the years. Terrified neighbors and teachers had begged authorities to step in, but help never came. The very safety net built to shield vulnerable kids from this exact nightmare failed over and over again, leaving the torture to end in tragedy. The courtroom drama that followed sparked massive public fury and outrage. Angela McAnulty faced heavy charges, reflecting the sheer brutality of her actions against such a defenseless little girl. The state presented sickening medical evidence of her injuries, alongside grim details of the hell Jeanette endured. Doctors testified about the severe starvation and systematic deprivation she had suffered. In February 2011, Angela McAnulty was convicted, becoming the first woman on Oregon's death row since 1984. It was a sentence matching the sheer horror of her crimes, showing a clear demand for the harshest possible punishment for such terrible acts against a child. Richard McAnulty got life in prison, with a chance of parole after 25 years for his dark role. For almost 10 years, Angela waited on death row as her endless appeals played out. In 2020, her lawyers successfully argued that her defense during the trial was completely incompetent. Her death sentence was thrown out, replaced by life behind bars with no hope of parole. Still a massive punishment, but saving her from the execution chamber. Then in December 2022, when Oregon's governor commuted every single death sentence, the debate mattered little. Angela McAnulty was destined to die in a concrete cell, no matter the legal label. Jeanette's tragic death forced the entire state to confront massive flaws in its welfare system. How could so many desperate warnings simply go ignored? What would it take to make sure this never happened again? Officials scrambled to fix the broken communication between agencies. They boosted caseworker training and drew up strict new rules for handling abuse claims. But for little Jeanette, those changes came too late. She spent her last years in pure agony, trapped in a living hell, while the adults around her failed to help. Her tragic story stands as a dark reminder that having child protection laws is never enough. Those systems actually have to work, run by people brave enough to act on the warnings. Angela McAnulty's cruel crimes challenge everything we think we understand about human nature. What drives a mother to inflict such calculated torment on her own child? How does love twist into pure malice? These are questions that offer no easy answers. And that is exactly what makes cases like this so deeply haunting. Today, Angela McAnulty is locked away in Oregon, ensuring she will never hurt another child. Jeanette Maples should not be remembered only for her death, but for the beautiful life. She deserved a life stolen by the mother who should have protected her. Yet Oregon's dark past holds more than just isolated horrors. It also hides cunning serial killers. Case number 7. Dayton, Leroy, Rogers. The Molalla forest kept its dark secrets for years, before anyone realized death was hiding there. To his neighbors, Dayton Leroy Rogers seemed like an ordinary mechanic in the Portland area, a quiet family man who kept a low profile. But through 1987 and 1988, Rogers lived a double life, as at least 8 women vanished from Portland streets. Their disappearances went unnoticed at first, blamed on their transient lives. Many were vulnerable souls struggling to survive on the streets, difficult situations, leaving them vulnerable and far less likely to be reported missing. The grim truth surfaced in August 1987, when a hunter found human remains in the Molalla forest. This grim discovery sparked an intensive search of the surrounding woods, and over the following weeks, investigators located 6 bodies buried throughout the wilderness. All the victims shared haunting similarities. They were all young women, living highly precarious, unstable lives. Someone targeted them, knowing their fragile situations meant they wouldn't be missed right away. The case intensified as forensics worked to identify the bodies and map out when they went missing. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods where the women vanished and questioned anyone who might have seen them. They started building profiles of the killer, but without a clear suspect. The case remained cold, even as more bodies appeared. Then on August 7th, 1987, Jennifer Lisa Smith became Rogers' last victim. But this time, everything changed. Rogers attacked the 25-year-old in a Denny's parking lot. But bystanders saw the assault and rushed to help, disrupting his plans and forcing him to flee. Although Smith was badly hurt, what the witnesses saw gave police their first major lead. Investigators quickly identified Dayton Leroy Rogers as the man who fled that diner parking lot. As detectives dug into his past, clear links to the Molalla forest bodies began to surface. He owned land nearby, had easy access to the burial sites, and perfectly matched the killer profile they had built. Locking him up finally allowed the state to build a rock-solid case, tying him to several murders. In 1988, Rogers was convicted for the attack on Jennifer Smith, but prosecutors were just getting started. By 1989, they secured 6 more convictions for the women discovered in the Molalla forest. The evidence was solid: forensic connections, geographic ties, and key witness testimonies. Plus, his own highly suspicious behavior when interrogated about his whereabouts during the crimes. The brutality of his crimes earned him the death penalty, not just once, but 4 different times during his long legal battles. Every single time, an appeal overturned his sentence. Prosecutors fought and won another death sentence, reflecting both the pure horror of his crimes and the system's drive to secure the ultimate punishment. Over the many decades Rogers spent locked up, Oregon's death penalty system changed dramatically. Governors declared moratoriums, courts debated appeals, and the public's view of the death penalty slowly shifted. Through all the legal chaos, Rogers still sat on death row. His file had become one of the longest-running death penalty cases in state history. In December 2022, Governor Kate Brown commuted all death sentences, changing his fate to life without parole. By then, the 71-year-old killer had already spent over 30 years behind bars. In reality, the impact was tiny. He was still going to die in prison no matter what. But for the victims' families, this was a devastating symbolic defeat handed down without their input. The Molalla forest murders showed how ruthless killers target society's most vulnerable, calculating that their target's marginalized status means nobody will investigate their sudden disappearance right away. He preyed on women he thought would be easily forgotten, whose sudden absence wouldn't trigger desperate searches or media outrage. And sadly, he was partially correct. It took many months and multiple gruesome discoveries before the true horror of his actions was revealed. Dayton Leroy Rogers remains behind bars at the Oregon State Penitentiary, now in his 70s, serving a sentence that ends only with his death. But the women he slaughtered are kept alive by grieving families who never stopped, fighting for answers, and by advocates working to ensure that vulnerable souls get the same relentless investigation as anyone else. His terrifying run serves as a stark warning that some predators deliberately hunt down those they view as helpless, and that true justice must protect everyone equally, no matter who they are. But not all of Oregon's horrors develop from slow, calculating patterns. Some killers struck with shocking boldness. Take Case 8, Edwin Lara. Trust is a privilege that should never be granted lightly. When that trust is shattered, the results are often deadly. Edwin Lara held a job that symbolized total safety. He patrolled Central Oregon Community College in Bend, working as a campus security officer. To students and staff, he was a trusted protector, a familiar face patrolling the campus and keeping them safe. No one suspected that this guardian harbored dark, violent urges that were about to tear lives apart. On July 24, 2016, 23-year-old Kaylee Sawyer was a student at the college. That night, she crossed paths with Lara, a meeting that would end in tragedy. Based on court evidence and Lara's own eventual confession, he brutally took her life before launching a calculated, multi-state crime spree of pure terror. After killing Kaylee, Lara tried desperately to cover his tracks and hide the evidence. But rather than staying in Bend to hide, he made choices that quickly turned a single murder into a terrifying multi-state crime spree. The next day, he drove to Salem and cornered 19-year-old Andrea Mays, forcing her into his vehicle at gunpoint. He kept her captive for hours, driving south while she sat in absolute terror, wondering if she would survive. As they drove, Lara began making chilling confessions to his captive. He told her he had an intense urge to kill, revealing that this violence was not some sudden impulse, but a dark compulsion he had harbored for years. Mays later called those hours the most terrifying of her life, never knowing if each passing second would be her last. The rampage spilled into California, where Lara's behavior grew increasingly erratic and reckless. At a California motel, he shot and severely wounded another victim. Though the target survived, the shooting added yet another violent chapter to Lara's escalating trail of terror. Next, he carjacked a family, forcing them out at gunpoint, while Mayas remained his hostage. Police across state lines coordinated rapidly as Lara's chaotic trail of violence showed no signs of stopping. The manhunt intensified, with officers working desperately to capture him before someone else got hurt. Finally, near the California-Oregon border, police closed in. They arrested Lara, finally freeing Andrea Mays from her horrific, day-long nightmare. Back in Bend, the community reeled from the devastating news of Kaylee Sawyer's death. She was a vibrant young woman with a bright future ahead of her, stolen by a man trusted to protect the campus. It was a deep betrayal, shattering the sense of safety for every student and staff member who trusted Lara to keep them secure. Investigators soon discovered that Lara had been secretly battling deeply disturbing thoughts, successfully hiding them from his coworkers and bosses. There were no warning signs in his past employment record, nothing to suggest he was capable of such extreme violence. He wore the mask of a reliable security guard while fighting dark urges he would eventually unleash. The legal system soon targeted him from multiple sides. Oregon state prosecutors charged Lara for the murder of Kaylee Sawyer, while federal prosecutors handled his multi-state crime spree, including kidnapping and carjacking. In January 2018, Oregon sentenced him to life without parole. The next year, a federal judge handed down a second consecutive life term, guaranteeing he would never walk free, regardless of which prison system held him. Kaylee's grieving family filed a civil lawsuit against the college, arguing that Lara's role as security made the crime possible, and that better background checks could have saved her. In 2020, they settled for $2 million, though no amount of money could replace their daughter. The tragedy also sparked massive legislative change. Kaylee's law passed in Oregon, creating strict new standards and screening rules for campus security officers. The new law was designed to stop anyone in a position of trust from abusing their power to hurt the students they should protect. Edwin Lara's actions represent a deeply terrifying kind of betrayal. He was not some stranger hiding in the dark, but someone students were trained to run to for help. A man whose uniform was a symbol of safety. This ultimate betrayal added a crushing layer of trauma for a community mourning Kaylee Sawyer. Today, Lara is locked away under 2 consecutive life sentences, his freedom gone forever, as punishment for the ultimate betrayal and the multi-state terror he inflicted. Kay Sawyer lives on through scholarships, memorials, and the law, bearing her name, ensuring her stolen life still matters Her legacy keeps protecting others. But not all of Oregon's criminals used violence. Some planned elaborate schemes born of pure greed, like Archie Cabello. The perfect crime existed only in Archie Cabello's head, but his family almost pulled it off. Armored car heists usually mean guns, violence, and wild police chases. But Archie knew the best heists are inside jobs crimes, where trust is weaponized and patience guarantees success. Over the course of 10 years, crossing 2 states and 3 separate hits, the Cabello family executed armored car thefts that netted nearly $4 million while avoiding detection longer than most criminals ever could. Their first heist struck Milwaukee in 1995. Archie worked for an armored car company, a job that gave him inside knowledge of routes, security protocols, and weak spots in the system. On the day of that first heist, over $150,000 vanished. Detectives investigated, but with no clear evidence of how it happened or who did it. The case eventually went cold. 3 years later, in 1998, another armored car theft hit Milwaukee. This time, over $700,000 vanished, under circumstances strangely similar to the first heist. Once more, police struggled to figure out how the job was pulled off or find any solid suspects. The Cabello family, meanwhile, hid their stolen cash with extreme care, avoiding the flashy spending that usually busts thieves who suddenly strike it rich. Relocating to Oregon, Archie got hired by Oregon Armored Services. It looked like a clean slate in a new state, with no visible ties to those old Milwaukee robberies. Archie, his wife Marion, and their son Vincent built a quiet life near Portland, acting like any normal working-class family. Then came December 6th, 2005, the day Archie pulled off his boldest heist yet. Driving his usual armored truck route, he set up an elaborate, fake armed robbery. The plan was simple: hand over $3 million to his son Vincent, then handcuff himself inside the armored truck to look like a helpless victim. This clever ruse was meant to keep suspicion off Archie while explaining where the cash went. At first, it worked. Archie called the police, spinning a wild story about an armed attacker who overpowered him and ran off with the loot. Detectives chased dead-end leads looking for an outside thief, never realizing the robber was no stranger. It was Archie's own son. Meanwhile, the Cabellos added that $3 million to their secret stash from those old Milwaukee heists, building a hidden fortune of nearly $4 million. But sitting on that much dirty cash takes extreme discipline. The family showed incredible patience, staying far away from luxury cars, big houses, and fancy vacations that normally expose wealthy crooks. Instead, they kept a low profile, paying everyday bills in cash to avoid a paper trail, while juggling over 100 credit cards to mask their money. They even rented a safe deposit box in Bellevue, Washington, keeping the bulk of their stolen fortune there, visiting only occasionally to avoid suspicion. For years, the trick worked. The 2005 Oregon heist sat cold, just like the Milwaukee jobs. The family kept up their quiet, ordinary routine, never giving any sign that they were sitting on a massive, stolen fortune. But federal agents never stopped digging, and deep financial audits eventually uncovered strange, mismatched spending patterns. The FBI and IRS started dissecting their lives, spotting major gaps between their low income and actual spending. How were they paying their bills with money that had no legal source? And why did they have such a massive web of credit cards? The deeper agents dug, the more questions they had. When federal agents finally got a warrant to search that Bellevue safe deposit box, they found concrete evidence linking the family to all 3 heists across 10 years and 2 states. This mountain of cash, paired with records and testimonies from turning family members, built an absolutely airtight case against them. Staring down the evidence, Marion and Vincent Cabello chose to cooperate with prosecutors. Their decision to help prosecutors build the case against Archie earned them shorter sentences of 15 to 18 months each. Archie, the mastermind behind all 3 thefts, was sentenced in March 2013 to 20 years in federal prison. The Cabello family crime spree lacked the raw violence of murder, but it still left a trail of devastating damage. They had systematically robbed their employers, abusing their trusted positions to build wealth through years of calculated lies and deception. But their ultimate downfall did not come from a single, sloppy mistake. Instead, financial investigators finally mapped out their patterns of stolen cash. Ultimately, 10 years of deception cost them their freedom and every single dollar they had taken. The perfect crime proved to be a myth. The Cabellos joined a long line of thieves who learned the hard way that to get away with stealing, you can never spend the money. Yet, Oregon's criminal history is not just made of elaborate financial schemes. Sometimes mindless violence explodes in broad daylight. Let's look at Case 10, Shiloh, Hampton. Some young lives are stolen for no reason at all, leaving devastated neighborhoods searching for answers. Shiloh Hampton was just 14, a high school freshman with a bright future ahead of him. On April 18, 2011, he was hanging out with friends near the Lloyd Center Mall, enjoying a mild spring evening in one of Portland's busiest areas. The corner of Holiday Park where they gathered should have been safe, a visible public space near busy main roads. But safety can prove to be a fragile illusion, shattering in seconds. Suddenly, gunfire shattered the peace. At least 12 shots targeted the group of teenagers hanging out together. Shiloh was hit in the head and stomach, suffering injuries so devastating that survival seemed unlikely. His friends scattered in panic, some fleeing for safety while others bravely tried to help him. Bystanders saw 3 hooded figures sprint away from the scene and leap into a white Mercedes that sped off. Paramedics arrived at the scene quickly, rushing Shiloh to a trauma center where doctors fought desperately to save him. For 2 agonizing days, he clung to life. But on April 20th, just 2 days after the shooting, the young teen died from his wounds. A 9th grader who should have only worried about homework became another tragic casualty of Portland's street violence. The intense investigation brought in over 100 officers, showing how deeply the brutal attack on a child shook the community and fueled their drive for justice. Detectives immediately swept the area and questioned witnesses, hunting through local security footage and chasing down tips from a public horrified by the crime. Soon, 2 suspects emerged from the shadows: 20-year-old Jimmy Ray Sanders Garcia and 21-year-old Edward Moore. Although evidence linked them to the shooting, the motive behind the attack remained entirely unclear. Was it a gang rivalry, mistaken identity, or a random tragedy? Police believed they had accomplices, and that the blame for the young boy's death went far beyond just these 2. Both young men were arrested and charged with first-degree murder, attempted murder for endangering the other teens, and unlawful use of a firearm. The serious charges reflected the horror of spraying bullets into a crowd of innocent kids, showing an absolute disregard for human life. While the court case brought a small sense of justice, nothing could ever replace the life taken from the Hampton family. The tragedy exposed Portland's deep struggles with teen violence and illegal guns, highlighting the endless cycles of revenge that catch innocent kids in the crossfire over petty disputes that make no sense to the outside world. In response, Shiloh's family began fighting to stop the bloodshed, turning their immense grief into a mission to protect other neighborhood kids. They joined neighborhood groups and backed local youth programs. They kept Shiloh's memory alive, fighting for the kind of real change that could prevent future tragedies. His school held memorials, and classmates honored him, refusing to let his life be defined solely by how it ended. Investigators kept searching for more suspects, convinced that others shared the blame for planning or carrying out the attack. Police pushed for tips, offering rewards and keeping pressure on anyone who knew what happened that April evening. To Portland, Shiloh's case was another brutal reminder of how gun violence steals young futures and tears families apart. A 14-year-old boy, standing with friends, should never have to face gunfire. A 9th grader should be planning for high school graduation, not being mourned at a funeral. His senseless death only deepened the community's resolve to tackle the root causes of violence before more young lives were stolen. Today, Shiloh Hampton is remembered not simply as another tragic victim or statistic, but as a young soul whose life mattered and whose bright potential was stolen, and whose memory still drives the fight for safer streets where kids can hang out without fear. His case remains a stark illustration of how fast violence can shatter everyday normalcy, and why those responsible must face full accountability. These stories from Oregon represent different, chilling forms of human darkness. From calculated family massacres to spontaneous public violence, from ruthless serial predators to elaborate financial schemes, each tragedy proves that evil wears many faces, demanding that the justice system adapt and communities stay vigilant to protect the vulnerable. These stories are not just history. They are warnings and lessons, proving that humanity is capable of both extreme cruelty and a relentless drive for justice.